But the passages in starting in 1 John 2 and verse number 15 really tie into the very next day on keeping the right perspective. And in 1 John 2 and verses 15 through 17, John tells his audience, and one thing we need to remember is that John is an old man. He's an old man when this is written. He's probably at the very least, he's got to be in his 80s, because as an apostle during the time of Jesus, even if and probably wasn't this young, but if he was 20 at that time, he's going to be in his late 70s at the very earliest. And so he's writing from a perspective of experience. And that's why in these epistles over and over again he refers to his audience as my little children. And he obviously he's not saying that they're little or that they're children, but he's speaking to them as one who has lived a long life and seen a lot of different things, and sharing this wisdom. And he says, "Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world." He says, "For if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, these things are not from the Father, but of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust thereof, but he who does the will of God abides forever." And so this is a great passage on perspective. About what's going on around us, as opposed to what is ultimately the most important thing. And so John is encouraging his audience to keep a proper perspective concerning the things that are of the world. Now, and the next couple lessons deal with this as well, but we'll go ahead and mention it here. Everything that is in the world is not necessarily wrong. I mean, there are things that are worldly, and those things are wrong. But there are things that are of this world that in and of themselves are not necessarily wrong. But even in regard to these things, we still have to maintain the right perspective about those things. So, our danger, and I'm just kind of making a blanket statement for us as Christians, as children of God. Obviously, we want to be discerning about what is right and wrong. But at the same time, we want to be discerning about what is good and what is better. In Luke 10 and verse 38 and following, where Martha is serving and and Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet, it wasn't a matter that Martha was doing wrong and Mary was doing right. It was that Martha was doing good, but Mary was doing better. Jesus didn't condemn her for trying to serve people and take care of their needs. He says, but Mary has chosen the better thing that will never be taken away from her. And so as we think about loving not the world or the things that are in the world, we want to make sure that we have the proper perspective about those things, and not allow the things that are neutral to draw us away from God and allow them to be negative things. All right, then you have the next passage in Ephesians chapter 4, and in verse number 17 beginning. Ephesians 4, verse 17. It says, "This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk, in the futility of their mind, having their understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God, because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who, being past feeling, have given themselves over to lewdness, to work all uncleanness with greediness, but you have not so learned Christ." Now, there is the sense in which this text is talking about walking as the Gentiles walk, right? But the question is, why did the Gentiles walk the way that they did? And Paul answers the question, and also it goes back into, we can read it in Romans chapter 1. The reason the Gentiles walked the way that they walked is that they separated themselves from God. In other words, verse 11 says, because of the ignorance that is in them. In other words, they've drawn so far away from God, they don't know God, they don't know the things of God. And then when a person gets to that point, then Pandora's box is open for anything to happen. In other words, the Gentiles didn't get where they were overnight. The same way, for example, we probably all know Christians who are living lives that in no way represent the life of a Christian. Whatever that thing is. But they didn't go from being a faithful Christian to being right there overnight. They drew themselves, or allowed, just for example, they may have just allowed the things that are in the world to draw them away from God. And then, having been drawn away from God, they forget the things of God. And then once one forgets the things of God, anything goes. And their consciences are seared. They say things, they do things, they practice things that at some earlier point in time they would have thought unimaginable in their lives. But they've become ignorant of the things of God. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be that it was something sinful that drew them away. But it was something in the world. And so with that in mind, we have the statement, the ignorance that is in them, the blindness of their heart, and then verse 19, they are past feeling. Their hearts are hardened. It's like, think about, there's more than one passage in the book of Jeremiah where Jeremiah asks this question about the people of God. Were they ashamed when they did, and he talked, were they ashamed when they committed all of these abominations? And then the prophet answers, no, they were not ashamed, neither could they, does anybody know the last word? Blush. They were not ashamed, they couldn't even blush at the things that they were doing as the people of God. And so, again, the warning is there for us as well. The warning is there for us. Don't allow ourselves to be separated from God by things that in and of themselves are of neither positive nor negative. All right, now let's go down into the bottom of page 49, talking about keeping the right perspective. Keeping the right perspective. And again, this is a segue into the bottom of page 49 is a segue into what we're already talking about. It says, the Bible does not teach that as Christians we cannot participate in ordinary activities and relationships of life, such as family, friends, recreation, school, job, etc. But we must always put Christ first and all else second. Again, keeping the right perspective. Top of page 50. From Revelation 3 and verse 16. If we do not understand these things, we may easily become, and I know you probably haven't filled the blank in, but if I were to ask you, what is the one word that described the church at Laodicea? One word that they were well known. Lukewarm. That's right. You are lukewarm. The Lord said, I wish you were cold or hot. He says, but because you are lukewarm, I will spew you out of my mouth. What caused them to be lukewarm? Well, they had put their trust in their financial situation, so to speak. They say, I'm rich, I'm increased with goods, and I don't need anything. About like the attitude of most people in America. I don't need anything. And Jesus says, you really ought to see yourself as you really are. You're poor, you're naked, and you're blind. And he says, go get some eye salve and correct your eyes so that you can see what you really are. Now, they weren't beyond the scope of the reach of Christ, because Jesus said in this same context, I stand at the door and knock. And if any man will open, I'll come in and dine with him, and he will dine with me. So Jesus is still knocking on the door of the lukewarm heart. Asking to be invited. When I say asking to be invited back in to their lives. So we want to be on guard against being lukewarm. All right. Then the passages here in the middle of the page. There are four texts. Matthew 6:24 through, and I don't know why 34. I mean, I don't know why it's not all in there, because if you're going to go to 33, you might as well go to 34. But having the proper perspective in the opening line is about having a proper perspective about money. And it goes actually all the way back to verse 19, where we're supposed to lay up our treasures in heaven. One thing we need to remember, though, is that when Jesus speaks in these types of terms, he's not commending one thing to the condemnation of another thing. He's trying to get people to have their priorities right. Is there anything wrong? Is there anything wrong with saving up your money for retirement? Everybody should do that, right? Everybody should say. Everybody should save money so that when they get beyond where they can work, they can still live without being a burden to other people. And by and large, as Americans, most of us are blessed to make enough money to do that. Okay? So when Jesus says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, he's not saying don't plan for the future or don't save money, for a rainy day or whatever. He's saying don't put your confidence in those things. He says, because where your treasure is, there your heart will be. So it's possible to do both of those things. It's possible to plan for the future while still keeping the Lord primary, in your life. So then from there it goes to no man can serve two masters in verses 22 through 24. He'll hate the one and love the other, or he'll hold the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. You cannot serve God and money. And then in verse 25 begins the discourse on, don't worry about your life, what you eat, what you'll drink, what you're going to wear. And the entirety of the rest of that text from verses 25 through 34 is talking about having faith that God will provide for us the things that are requisite, things that we need. Not the things that we want or think that we need. God will provide for us the things that we need. And in that list of illustrations, one is, why are you worried about the clothes that you wear? The lilies of the field are far more beautifully dressed than Solomon in all of his glory. The richest man, the richest man that ever lived could not produce clothing that exceeds how God clothes the flowers that grow in the wild. And then you have worrying about our food. And Jesus said, look at the sparrows. They don't sow, they don't reap, they don't gather into barns, and your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than aren't you much more valuable than a little bird? And he goes to the conclusion. Don't worry about what you're going to eat, what you're going to drink, what you're going to wear. He says, these are the things that the Gentiles seek after. In other words, people that are not minded toward God. But seek, verse 33, the conclusion is, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. It says, and take no thought for tomorrow. It says, for tomorrow will take care of its own things. Sufficient to every day is its own trouble. Again, the passage is not condemning planning for the future or thinking about what you're going to do tomorrow. It's a passage that in its context says, don't worry. Don't worry. Then you have Mark 10, 17 to 22. And this is the account of the rich young ruler. You know, here's a man, and I've got a sermon. I didn't write it. I heard somebody else preach it, but I thought it was really good, so I preached it. But the sermon about the rich young ruler is, he came in the right way. No, the Bible says he was running. Right? He came to the right person, which was Jesus. Yeah. He asked the right question. What must I do to inherit eternal life? But then he gave the wrong response. Right? Now, everything about the young man was right. Until Jesus told him, really what Jesus did was Jesus revealed where his heart really was. And he went away sorrowful. I think Mark's account is given because it says Jesus knew this man's heart. But I think there's an interesting little statement in here. What must I do? Good master, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus, why do you call me good? There's none good but God. Jesus is not denying that he's God. He's simply showing the young man that you've called me by a title that I'm about to show you that you really don't believe. He says, you know the commandments. He says, and then the response is, all these I have kept from my youth. What do I lack? Yet another good question, right? What do I lack? Mark's account says this, and Jesus, looking at him, loved him. Mark's account is the only account that provides that commentary. He loved him. Did Jesus know what that young man's response was fixing to be? From the very start, right? From the very time that he asked, why do you call me good? Until the time he's fixing to tell him, go and sell all that you have, give it to the poor, and follow me, and you'll have treasures in heaven. Jesus knew how this thing was going to end up. And yet the Bible still says he loved him. He loved him. Last Wednesday night at Hamilton, I preached the sermon on understanding the love of Jesus from John 13. Where Jesus, it says twice in chapter 13 and verse 1, twice it says he loved them. He loved them. In spite of the fact he knew that Judas was going to betray him, Peter was going to deny him, and the other 10 were going to desert him. Still says 2 times he loved them. And then at the end of the text, it still said, he said it out loud with his own mouth. You love one another as I have loved you. And so, but the matter of priority is that we have to love God above all things. Have to love God above all things. And when we love God above all things, it helps us make better decisions. Now, if we're already minded in a particular direction, it helps me make better decisions. If I'm weak in my faith, what ought to be an easy decision can become a dilemma. Because I feel like I'm between a rock and a hard place. When, if my faith was strong, I'm really not in between a rock and a hard place. If I'm just minded to do what God says. And then Luke 9:23 to 26. Again, another unique passage on a phrase that is found elsewhere in the Scriptures. There are a number of places in the Gospel accounts, in the Synoptics, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where Jesus said we have to take up our cross. Okay? But Luke's account in verse 23 adds one more element to this. And it's a single word where he says, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. But there's a word in between those two. What is it? Daily. Luke gives us one more word there. Let a man deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. You know, we have to, and the word there helps us to understand that the cross is not simply something that we can take up and take on and take off. Take on and take off. Because when a man was crucified, you know, he was there, for lack of a better, he was stuck there, right? You know, no pun intended. A man didn't go on a cross and come off a cross and go on a cross and go off a cross. No, it was a permanent situation. Take up his cross daily. Now, when we wake up in the morning, it's not like we put off the cross when we go to bed. It's that when we wake up, the first thing we are mindful of is, I've got a cross to bear today. I've got a cross to bear today. And so Luke's account gives us that one little extra comment. Take up his cross daily. And then Philippians 3, 4 through 8. And this is a text where Paul is talking about his former life as a Jew. I've sometimes referred to him, when the Lord called Paul, then known as Saul of Tarsus, on the road to Damascus, he was a Jewish leadership rising star. And he said even of himself, I excelled above my equals in the Jews' religion. In other words, it'd be like Luke, if you were hired, Luke, if you were hired in with 10 other guys, and you're all about the same age, same experience and everything, and then at the end of 5 years, you're the, I don't know how the word, lieutenant, is that, or a captain, or you're that, and all the other guys are really where they're supposed to be, but you've excelled above where everybody else would have normally been. That's what Paul is describing as his life as a Jew and as a Pharisee. Everybody else, I excelled above my peers in the Jews' religion. And then he talked about his personal bona fides. I'm of the tribe of Benjamin. I'm circumcised the 8th day. I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. In other words, here are all of my qualifications of greatness. He says, and all of these things I counted but loss that I might win Christ. In other words, Paul had a proper perspective concerning what was really, really important. Now, there's a passage that I want to look at just very quickly that goes with this, and that is Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. And starting in verse 24 through verse 27. Hebrews 11, verses 24 through 27. Talking about having the right perspective, proper sense of values. Where was Moses raised? In Egypt. And not just in Egypt, but where in Egypt? In Pharaoh's house. That's right, Kyle. In Pharaoh's household. Verse 24. By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, For he endured as seeing him who is invisible. I mean, think about what Moses gave up. He was raised by the most powerful family in the world. A family that had limitless power, finances, the finest things that anybody could imagine. And he was living there. And then as a young adult, when he became of age, he walked away from it to be a slave. He walked away from it to be a slave. But why does the text say that he did that? He could see the end of what it was to be one of God's people as opposed to what it was to be one of Pharaoh's people. And he could see the end. He esteemed one thing as greater than another. Notice, he esteemed the riches that God provides as greater than the riches that Pharaoh could provide, even though the riches that Pharaoh could provide were literally in his grasp, and the riches that God provided could only be understood or appreciated by faith. That's one of the greatest examples of perspective that is anywhere in the Scriptures. In my estimation, by far.
Tom,
Sir.
Moses went from walking in a palace every day to living in the dirt.
Living in the dirt, that's right. I mean, a slave.
He went from like I said, walking in a palace every day, playing in the floor, to living in a hut or living in a house with a dirt floor.
Yep, and having to work 7 days a week.
Just to eat.
Yeah. He went from never having to hit a lick to being a slave working 7 days a week without rest.
Because those people, everybody was a servant, and they provided for the Pharaoh before they ate.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that's, again, the picture of perspective. To me, again, it's one of the greatest biblical illustrations of perspective. All right. So now I want to go to page 51, thinking about perspective with regard to modesty and propriety. You absolutely can ask me a question. Yes, sir.
It says that he esteemed the reproach of Christ greater than the treasures in Egypt. Is there anything to that? Because obviously Moses would not have known anything about Christ.
Only perhaps in the sense that he understood all the previous statements concerning the Messiah, and that's what the promise given to Abraham. That's all I got for you on this. But I'll try to look at it. But that's ultimately, I think that's what it is. There's a sense in which Moses is a picture of Jesus. In that Moses left, as John said, the palace of the Pharaoh to be, a slave. And Jesus left heaven in order to be a human being. And not only that, a poor, to be raised in a poor household. So it may be what we like to call like a type, anti-type situation. All right, on day 35 on modesty and propriety. I'm just going to make a quick statement on this, and then as time permits, we'll talk more about it. Just about every single time I hear 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Peter 3 used in regard to modesty, it's used in the opposite way that the Bible uses it. When you hear people talking about modesty, 99 times out of 4, you're going to hear them talk about, people wearing too little clothes, not enough clothes, or clothes that draw undue sexual attention, right? And both of these, or somebody say, neither of these texts is talking about that. The word modest in this text is more aptly applied to the phrase, he lived modestly. Modestly. Now, what do we mean by that? If I say a man lived modestly, what does that mean? All right, number one, he lives within his means, not without extravagance. Okay, and it also, think about not showy. That's right. Sam Walton. Visiting his stores in a pair of overalls and an old Ford pickup truck. One of the richest men on the planet. When he died. And if you met him on the street, you'd never know that he had anything, and he would never tell you that he had anything. Living modestly. That's the terminology that is being utilized in these two passages on women and their attire. It's that it is to be modest. I'm not saying that you can run around naked. All right. What I'm telling you is the passage is teaching that you're to dress. That dress is to be in such a way as to not draw undue attention to oneself in the form of extravagance. Right. Now there are obviously other biblical principles at play that help us to understand that that all of us, but particularly ladies, need to be covered up. Need to be covered up. We can even go back into the Old Testament and look. I don't want to make a hard and fast case for this, but there was a statement that was made in regard to the dress or the attire of the priesthood, and the thing that was given there was that the priesthood was to make sure that their thighs were covered, lest their nakedness be exposed when they went up on the altar. In other words, even the priests were to be covered up to a certain degree, with regard to their thighs. And so, there's a principle involved that again, it even goes back to the priesthood. But we need to. We need to, number one, use the text as it's supposed to be used, and that is that we don't dress to try to be a fashion plate or we don't dress to try to draw attention to ourselves because of what we are wearing. All right, that's what the text is saying. And it's talking about with braided hair and gold and pearls, and those were all ornamental things that were designed to draw attention to somebody as being somebody, having something. Obviously we know that it's not wrong for women to wear jewelry. It's not wrong for them to wear even gold jewelry. Again, I'm not going to make a hard and fast case, but when Isaac got a wife, the first thing he did was, and this is going to make some of y'all old people really upset, he put a gold ring in her nose. And we look at people running around with rings in their noses now, and we're like, that's the most disgusting thing ever. And yet, one of the most well-known men in all of the scriptures put a gold ring in his fiance's nose, or his future bride's nose. All right. So, and by the way, I'm not saying that everybody needs to go get a nose ring. Right? I wish you wouldn't. All right. But the point is that there were ways that even back then that people dressed in order to try to present themselves as somebody. And the Bible tells us not to regard people in that respect. For example, in James chapter 2, James says, you have a feast, and here comes the man who comes in well dressed. and you give him the best seat at the table, and then a poor man comes in, he's wearing rags, and you put him down at the bottom of the table. Because in those days, and still in many places around the world, there's a pecking order, so to speak, of where you sit at the table. And I can tell you that's true because it's still true in Ghana. And I never felt comfortable sitting at what they called the high table. I know they were trying to honor us, but it made me feel uncomfortable. All right? But James says, you take the man that's well-dressed and you set him at the best seat, and you take the poorly dressed man and you put him down here at the bottom, at the end of the table, or maybe sitting on the floor, off the end of the table. And James says, let me ask you a question. Who are the people who drag you into court? Is it the poor man that drags you into court, or is it the rich man that drags you into court? In other words, why are you showing preference to people who treat you like dirt because they can? And so this idea, the idea of dress, even today, is still important. But we want to use the passages, we want to use them properly. In other words, we don't want to dress in an ostentatious way as to draw attention to ourselves. I remember back in the day when Easter Sunday was the day, right? Man, they busted out the new dresses, the hats. I mean, the whole thing. Listen, I'm not against dressing up. All right. In fact, in many cases, I'm for it. All right? But the church is not a place to try to draw attention, especially not a place to try to draw attention to yourself or ourselves in that respect. All right. So we want to use the word modestly appropriately. I think we all understand we need to cover up. And we're getting to the time of year when it's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. But, Josie Lee bit it. I bet she's going to be okay. All right, next week, day 36. Next week, day 36.